So in this lesson, we're going to look at the custom components, specifically tFileExcel component. In this example, we're going to be using a couple of files. We have a scenario where a client wants to write data to a template Excel sheet, and they want specifically to preserve the style of the template sheet. Now this is a horrible thing to have in Talend or any other ETL tool because most of them are not capable of writing into Excel into a particular cell and then preserving styling like coloring and other features. Standard components of Talend will not have the capability. You can only do two things. You can either amend to a file, which means it will look and find the last row which is empty and start writing to that one, or just simply create a new Excel output file and start writing to it from the beginning. And to that you can add the heading and the following data. You could add some trickery to it by having a tfix flow input that would input a certain amount of data at the beginning and then append to it and input the main data, but that's about the maximum flexibility that you have with the standard components. This is why we've downloaded the tFileExcel components, with which you could actually do a lot of pretty cool stuff. Now, if we go back to the example that we have a client that wants to add data to this sheet in this workbook. So what the client wants is to add most of the data in column B to H, starting from column 11. They want to preserve both the actual heading and the pre-heading, which is basically a description for whoever opens up the workbook. They also want to add the client name as the description suggests in B5 column, and they also want to add a client name here. This tells you that whenever the data is coming in, it's only for one client, since they're only specifying the client name here and here. They also want to make sure that the data is always ended with a footer, as that would symbolize the ending of the file. And also they want to make sure that the structure also has the template, other data, and sheet 1 sheets within the workbook. Now you can see that with the standard Talend components for Excel files, it would be pretty much impossible to preserve the structure. What you could do is probably remove the footer and tell Talend to write to append, so it would write data here, and you could even set an empty column here, so nothing would be written here. So you could get away with writing data to these columns, but then you have a problem where you need to write data to client name in B4 position and in B5 position, and also update date in B7. Now with the standard components, it's impossible to tell Talend that you want to write data specifically here, or data next to a column that contains in column A contains a name, client name. So how would Talend do that? It's impossible. So this is why we're using the custom components. Now there's a slight learning curve to these components, but once you get a hang of them, pretty straightforward. I would also advise to going on the exchangetalend.com website and looking into those components. Once you open them, you should be able to find a PDF file that is actually a good description of the component, what each feature of every component does, and it has some examples. So let's begin by looking at the job. Let's expand the job so we can see the entire thing. The first thing the job does is it sets a global variable, which would be the date. So here we can see we're getting the current date as talendDate.getCurrentDate, and then we're reformatting it into a string in a particular format. Because if we look back at the Excel file, you can see that we need to input an update date, and it has a type of date and the format date of YYYY So that is exactly what we're doing here, setting that up. Then the differences come in. With the standard components, you just specify the input and an output, and you specify the path of the file. With these custom components, what you need to do is actually open up a tFileExcel workbook open component, and in that component you specify which file you want to open. In the output or input files for tFileExcel, you don't specify the file, you then reference the workbook which is loaded into memory from this dropdown. So first off, we need to specify two input files. We need the template file, and we also need the lookup file. Now we could have used the standard component for the lookup file because we're not doing anything amazing there, but just for the consistency, we're using both. I'll get back to the lookup file just in a second. So after we open up two of the files, or once this subjob is complete, we're moving on to set update date component, which is actually a tfix flow input. In this component, we're specifying one column, and we call it update date. We're getting the global map.get string data we stored in the global variable at the beginning of the job. And what we're doing here is, if we expand this, we are selecting the open template workbook. We're saying that we want to use the sheet name called client date, which is this current sheet. We are then saying that we want to start our index of rows from row 7, which also makes sense because we can see that the data where we need to put it is on row 7. Then what we're doing is we're saying use individual column position, and we're saying for column update date, the name here doesn't really matter. We're saying sheet column name is B. So basically you're saying B7, that's where you should put the information. Then we're also saying reuse conditional format from the first data row. And what this would mean is if there is any formatting or styling set to this row, that it will preserve that styling. The styling might be coloring or how you position the information within the cell, things like that. So we just want to say that whatever's there, just keep it as it is. So once that's done, we're moving on to the main part of the job. The data for this template has to come from a delimited file. That delimited file is delimited by a pipe, and if we look at the example that we've created here, we have two rows of data. So we have the heading and we have two rows of data. So you can see this is the client name, this is the client ID, those are some dates, and this ID correlates to a currency. Now in the sheet itself, we can see that the currency should be looked up in currency type file. So they don't want this ID, they want the actual currency, because the person who might be looking into the produced results in the template wouldn't understand what 002 stands for. Is it, what kind of currency is it? And finally, we have some value, which is the amount. So if we close out of this and open up the currency code lookup, we can see three columns. The headings are source code, currency code, and country code. And here you can see that those are the codes that we looked at previously. So we have 002, which stands for GBP, which is United Kingdom pound. So we need to remap that part from the delimited file before we submit any information to these columns. So in order to do that, we open the file up here, open lookup. So now that we have defined the input, we then add a lookup file here. So we specify tFileExcel sheet input, and for the workbook we use the second one, open lookup. Once that is done, we specify where the row starts, and we just say at the beginning we want to stop it when it reaches the end. And if you view the schema, we can see all three rows. So we're just simply moving the data into CMap, same as with the standard component. So now we need to remap the data, and here you can see our main input and our secondary lookup. So we're simply saying that the match between the first and the second occurs on CUTIP, which is the code, and whenever the code matches, instead of getting the code, move the currency code to currency here. The output is also split into two parts, and the reason for that is that the main information is stored from column B to column H here, starting from row 11. However, we also need to input the client name and client ID. So that is what is happening here. The second output is specifically for those two values. Since the source input has those two values, so if we open up the source again, we can see that we have the client name and the client ID both present in the source file, but we don't need to move them here. We need to specify them just once in these two locations. Now, there was another approach that you could use to achieve the same result. You could have used, so let's click out of this, you could have used the same tfixed flow input again after this subjob routine, and you would just specify two columns and hard code the values or use context values here. So whenever you run the job, you could specify the client name and client ID, and those would be passed in. For this example, I've decided to completely remove that manual step, and I would always advise, if possible, always remove the manual step, because manual steps are prone to errors, especially if a user is inputting that step. What if they mistype it? It wouldn't be a huge problem, it wouldn't break the job, but they would have to then rerun the job because they mistyped, or go in and manually update it in the Excel spreadsheet. And the whole purpose of Talend is to remove as many manual steps as possible and streamline the job. However, before we move, so if we go back to those two additional columns that we need to pass in, what we have to do is, as you can see, I've already run the job, so you can see two rows are coming back, and that is because from our source we have two rows of data. Now those two rows are completely identical, and we need to remove all the duplicates. So ultimately we want only one row of data to be passed. The reason is that if we go further to add extras and make this full screen, you can see that we're also, again, using the workbook open template. We're using sheet name client data. Then we're using a unique feature of this component. And what this unique feature does is, as the name suggests, exchange row columns. So what it does is a transposition from a row to column base. So imagine the values that are passed here. You have two values that are coming in as a row, but if we look at the example here, we see that we don't want to input them as rows, we want to input them as columns, because otherwise we would override the value here. So this is a very cool little feature that you can use. Obviously, you can achieve a similar result if you do t-normalize or t-denormalize component, but that's an additional step that you would have to do beforehand, and then the result set would be placed inside an Excel file. And on top of it, you wouldn't be able to specify the following. You wouldn't be able to specify the row start index position, which is 4, and the column starts with position B. So what we're doing is we're moving two values in column style into these two cells. So if we go back out of here to the job, for the main data, we're specifying it again slightly different. Here we're also using the same open template, but instead we're not using the exchange row. What we're saying here is a row start index is 11. So if we look here, this is our index 11, and then we're saying use individual column position. So here what we're saying is that as date, data that's coming in from the tmap should go into cell C, starting from position 11. So it would go here. eDate would go here, and so on and so forth. One additional neat new feature in this component is date or number format. So for instance, we know that CDate and eDate are supposed to be dates of format YYYY DD. And here, this is exactly what we're specifying here. So we are 100% certain that when the output is written and finally saved, we know that those two columns will have that format, and Excel will perceive them correctly. Because if, as you might know, if you've used tFile output Excel component, the standard one, in the past, if you specify numbers or double or those type of values, Talend will try to write them that way. But when you open up the result Excel file, those would actually be stored as generic. So this is what we're doing for total due. Here we're specifying the format, which is comma and dot delimited. And finally, we're saying remove last empty row. So if we look at the example, since we're only writing two rows of data, that will write here, and we will have one empty space and then a footer. So this will remove anything that comes after whatever has been written starting from row 11. So we'll write 2 and remove the rest. So because of it, we will need to do one final step here. We are again using a tFileExcel input. We're adding one column, and we're hard coding a string value of footer, and we're simply saying append to existing rows, append to column A, and just grab the values from column footer and just add them in. Once that is done, there's one more important part to using those custom components. You have to use tFileExcel workbook save. That's the reason why we downloaded that extra component. In this component, you specify which workbook you want to save, and we're only interested in saving the open template workbook. We are specifying where we want to save the file using the context values. And also, it has a capability to create directory if that directory does not exist. So you could create a new file instead of pointing to an existing file. And also, a really cool feature is that you can remove unnecessary sheets from the output file. And this would be helpful if we take a look at tFileExcel sheet output. You have a feature here called create sheet as copy. So you can create within the open workbook, create another copy of the workbook, make modifications there, and save it, or then remove the source one. So it's totally up to you of how you want to save it. But let's see what this workbook does. So here we have the example. Remember how it looks. Let's run the job. Let's go to the output, open it up. And look, we've preserved the styling. You can see that none of the columns have been modified, offsetted, or anything like that. So even though nature's frameworks, the client name, the name is longer, it didn't reformat the length of this, and it preserved the coloring because the client set those three columns as blue. It hasn't changed anything here. It only added data where required. And look, this formatting is set to what we've specified, so it's both comma for thousands and dot for the cents, and it adds a footer at the end. So as you can see, with these components, you can do a lot of really cool things for the client. Okay, so this was the lesson on custom components. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon.